And we're back to the MobilityWOD. Welcome back to the project. Here's what we got going on today. One of our athletes asked, hey, could you do a piece about acetabular impingement syndrome, or AIS? And basically when you have an impinged hip, what's essentially happening is the femur is rolling, sliding, and gliding, or not rolling and sliding and gliding, and slamming into the top of the acetabulum. And what ends up happening is that that beautiful round hip ends up becoming more of a mushroom as the bone kind of grows around in reaction to that concussion and that kind of concussive deformation. What ends up happening is that it blossoms into a mushroom, and then it turns into a gigantic pickaxe, and then boom, you've probably got a torn labrum, maybe you're cruising towards a hip replacement. The problem is that it's very, very painful. And if you look at it just from a simple mechanics, when you're missing this pure flexion range of motion, a couple things happen. One is that you're going to be limited in the bottom of your squat, and so that hip is going to early impinge. And one of the issues with that early impingement is then I'm probably going to, because I can't run any further, my psoas is going to take over and I'm going to pull me, so I'm going to end up overextended. In fact, when you see kind of this impingement process, oftentimes it's related to two things, or two things kind of go concurrently with it. They're kind of concurrent sequelae, I guess, for lack of a better word, cofactors. And one is that oftentimes the athlete initiates with too much pelvic tilt to start, and we want to block that by squeezing the butt, which limits the kind of excursion of L5, S1, this kind of break in the low back. What we want to do is try to set the back very tight so that when I pivot, I hinge from having a single hip joint. I don't create lots of hip joints, so it's early, and if I overextend, then I get early kind of hip involvement. So that hip ends up running into the pelvis much earlier than if I remain in a much more neutral position. The second thing that happens is that the athlete is trying to unimpinge the hip, usually about 30 degrees. They settle down, and we're either missing internal rotation of the hip, and that's why that knee is coming in, or they're missing external rotation of the hip. They just can't get that leg out. We're going to try to really actively spin that leg into an active external rotation force, big toe on the ground, try to create as much torque as possible to unimpinge the hip. That gives me more room under the acetabulum. When I just turn my feet out 30 degrees, what ends up happening is I'm not able to generate a lot of torque to clear the hip mechanism, and then my default, if I'm missing a little range of motion, is to turn in, because I start with an externally rotated position. So I want to actively externally rotate, block the hip, sets me up to a much better position where I can settle down and get my leg out of the way of the moving femur. Okay? So here's a couple of ways to think about fixing that. If you can reset that roll, slide, and glide into the bottom of the hip, you can improve the mechanics of that flexion. And so the general rule is to improve flexion of either the hip or the shoulder, we mobilize to the back of the socket. So to improve this, if I tested and just sit tall and pull this up, this is about the end of my hip range, and I should be about 120 easily. That would be the test. What we're going to do is distract that hip laterally so I don't get that big pinch, and then I'm going to imagine driving the hip to the back of the knee. Or, drive this femur into the back of the socket. Externally rotate, and just hang out here, and really imagine that the load is coming out through the femur. And then I can just oscillate back and forth, or I can just get some approximation and hang out with that knee driving into the back. Do this for 2 or 3 minutes. Change this in different positions. If you're feeling a pinch on the inside, go ahead and wind up. Take a little bit more of that lateral distraction. The band is pulling perpendicular to the line of force and kind of right square with that femur. Then, even just in 2 seconds there, that retest position looks like, and it's much better because I've been able to improve that mechanical efficiency, relocate the hip in the back of the socket, and unimpinge my hip. So that's a really nice self-fix. It's going to be stiff. The other thing we're going to do is go ahead and look at distraction of that femur this direction in that kind of deep posterior capsule. And I can hang out in this position and try to get some big distraction here. So as I pull this knee up, it's a little bit different than me kind of driving to the back. This is working a little bit different part, and I'm trying to improve my range and mobilize with movement, which is a Brian Mulligan technique, who's a New Zealand PT, a really good guy, and smart idea about mobilizing with movement. So I'm just going to pull in. I can do my normal calf or normal hamstring mob here. I can oscillate in and out. I can contract, relax. I can load up and pull. But the distraction force is pulling the hamstring here. That will also improve that ranging so that I have improved much better mechanics, so I'm not kind of compressing early. Last idea, make sure that you're rock solid, you're not breaking that rib cage. That always leads to a pelvic fault this way, that pelvic fault, early impingement. We'll see you tomorrow.